The mastaba sits on the western side of the Giza Plateau. Within the long shadow of the pyramid, its occupant is credited with building. The man whose name is carved above the entrance shaft was the pharaoh's cousin, his vizier, and the holder of a title that every academic biography and museum label translates the same way. He is the settled answer to the question of who built the Great Pyramid of Khufu. His name appears in the administrative records of the 4th dynasty. His statue stands in a museum in Germany. He is in the textbooks. He is the conclusion Egyptology reached in the 1920s and has not substantially revisited since. His burial chamber was excavated by the Austrian Archaeological Institute between 1912 and 1929. The shaft had been accessed in antiquity, the burial disturbed at some point across the millennia that separated its original ceiling from the moment Hermann Junker's team reached the bottom of the shaft. What the chamber did not contain when they arrived was the man, no mummy, no skeletal remains. The burial goods that should have accompanied a person of his rank, the canopic equipment, the carved vessels, the funerary texts prepared for what came after, none of these were recovered. The chamber held stone and the marks of what had been removed. The name in the record is Hemiunu. His mastaba is catalogued as G4000 in the Giza site registry. His statue, recovered from a sealed chamber within the mastaba's superstructure, now stands in the Romer and Pelizaeus Museum in Hildesheim. The burial chamber that should hold his remains holds nothing, and the hieroglyphs that carry his name read against what they actually assign to him rather than what the standard account assumes they must mean, describe something the biography consistently leaves out. They describe a man who received a plan he did not draw. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. The title that appears beside Hemiunu's name in the official record is Imi Ashar Kate NBT NT NSW. It is the phrase on which the entire claim that he designed the Great Pyramid rests. Every account of his role leads with this title, translates it as Director of all royal works, and steps from there to architect without pausing on the distance between those two things. But Merer is a supervision route. It names someone positioned above a process as its overseer, someone whose function is the management of execution rather than the origination of design. Cat means labor and construction activity, the physical work of moving and setting material. The full phrase designates the person overseeing all construction projects undertaken on the king's behalf. In contemporary terms, this belongs to a construction program director, a chief of infrastructure, the official who coordinates the resources required to build things the king has already decided to build. It is a management title and a logistics title. It is not a design title. Egyptian administrative language from the Old Kingdom maintained a careful distinction between managing construction and originating design. The person who established the spatial logic of a structure, who calculated its dimensions, set out its geometry on the ground before the cutting began, and determined the placement of its internal spaces, drew on different glyph routes than the person who oversaw the workers and materials executing that geometry. A man named Nekebu, who served in an architectural capacity under a later Old Kingdom pharaoh, carries in his Giza tomb biography a different title entirely, one drawing on the route for measuring, laying out, and marking ground. Nekebu's own inscription describes his progression from manual worker to designer in terms specific enough that the function is unmistakable. He describes setting out plans, marking dimensions, and working with proportions. The vocabulary is different from Hemiunu's. The role is different. The Old Kingdom preserved this distinction in its administrative vocabulary because it was a functional distinction. Designing and overseeing construction were not the same role, and the titles were not the same words. The existence of a recorded design vocabulary in Egyptian administrative practice makes Hemiunu's absence from it more significant, not less. The culture had the language for naming a design originator. It did not use that language for Hemiunu. Hemiunu's attested title places him on the oversight side of that distinction. The design side does not appear with his name in any surviving inscription from his lifetime. The standard account has bridged this gap by inference, assuming that the most senior construction official must also have been the design originator. The assumption is natural. It is also without textual support. What Hemiunu's role required was enormous. the administrative coordination of labor, material chains, and logistical systems operating across years and covering the movement of millions of tons of stone. His authority was real. His position in the Fourth Dynasty hierarchy was among the highest an official could hold. None of that is in question. What is in question is whether the title that names all of that also names the person who originated the geometry the stone was cut to fit. The record suggests it does not. There is a second text that addresses where the design came from, one written on papyrus rather than stone, preserved by circumstance rather than commission, and held now in the Egyptian Museum in Berlin under the catalog number Papyrus Berlin 3033. Scholars call it the Westcar Papyrus, named after Henry Westcar, through whose collection it passed in the 19th century. It is a compilation of literary narratives set during the Fourth Dynasty and composed in its surviving written form during the Middle Kingdom. Literary texts are not administrative records, and they are not treated as such here. But literary texts preserve the cultural assumptions of the people who wrote them, the things so widely understood that a story could name them in passing without pausing to define them. In one of the Westcar Papyrus narratives, the Pharaoh Khufu asks his sons a question. He wants to know the number of the secret chambers inside the sanctuary of Thoth. He tells them he wants something like those chambers for his own horizon, his own pyramid. A son suggests that a sage might know where the relevant information could be found. The narrative moves forward from there. The Westcar Papyrus has other stories to tell, but in the premise that exchange establishes, stated as background rather than plot, Khufu does not hold the design of his pyramid's interior at the start of his project. He is looking for it. He knows the chambers of Thoth exist. He knows they hold the model he wants to follow. He is working from a prior source, something old enough to be attributed to Thoth, the deity whose domain in the Egyptian religious tradition covers measurement, calculation, the scribal arts, and the transmission of knowledge across time. Thoth's sanctuary is not a building any excavation has identified. The Westcar Papyrus does not locate or describe it. The author does not explain it because the assumed readership already understood the reference. What the passage establishes is a cultural assumption that a prior body of architectural and geometric knowledge existed, was attributable to the divine tradition of measurement and scribal arts, and was something Khufu sought out rather than something his court generated from scratch. The design of the pyramid, in the literary memory of the civilization that built it, was not understood as a Fourth Dynasty creation. It was an inheritance Khufu tapped. This places the question of the design's authorship in territory the official record consistently refuses to enter. Hemiunu administered the execution. The administration, the logistics, the coordination of a workforce operating at a scale the ancient world had never seen, these are what his title names and what his status reflects. The question of who worked out the geometry that execution was built to produce is the question the record does not answer. The Merer Papyri add a third angle to this. Found at Wadi el-Jarf on the Red Sea coast in 2013, these are the oldest papyri recovered in Egypt. They date to the reign of Khufu and record the daily activities of a man named Merer, an inspector overseeing the transport of Tura limestone to the Giza plateau for the pyramid's outer casing. Merer's records are granular in the way that functioning administrative documents need to be. They name team sizes, volumes of stone moved, transit times, and the officials whose authority governs specific parts of the operation. They represent a genuine internal window into the construction as a working enterprise, not a commemorative record produced after the fact. What Merer does not record across a single surviving entry is the name of the person responsible for the pyramid's design. The project appears in his journal as Akhet Khufu, the horizon of Khufu, a fixed destination for the material deliveries he coordinates. Officials appear in connection with logistics and material authorization. The design itself, the entity from which the pyramid's angles and chamber placements and dimensional relationships derive, is not a process that any named person is performing during the period Merer documents. It exists as a prior specification to which the work is being built, not as an ongoing activity whose results are feeding into the construction chain in real time. Egyptian administrative texts were meticulous about attribution because accountability ran through names. The chain of who authorized what, who directed whom, who received which materials, was recorded because it was functionally necessary. An official receiving stone at the wrong volume had to be identifiable. An overseer who failed to deliver his team to the right location had to be traceable. The record-keeping was a management system, not a ceremonial one, and its granularity was real. The consistent absence of a design authority in the most detailed surviving administrative document from the construction period indicates the design was already complete before the administrative chain Merer was part of began to operate. It was not being produced alongside the stone cutting. It was the prior given from which the stone cutting proceeded. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more stories like this one. The mathematical relationships the Great Pyramid embodies have drawn sustained attention since the 19th century, when researchers first observed that the ratio of the base perimeter to the height closely approximates the value of 2 times pi. The approximation holds to a precision that the construction tolerances do not account for as coincidence. The relationship between the height and the slope of the face corresponds to a proportional value that appears in later Egyptian mathematical papyri, the Rind Papyrus and the Moscow Papyrus among them, where such relationships are presented under the framing of inherited procedures. The scribal tradition transmits these ratios rather than derives them. The papyri do not explain how the values were first established. They present them as things already known, things to apply. The pyramid makes those relationships physical, at a scale requiring certainty before the first course of stone was placed. The calculation had to precede the construction. The orientation of the 4 base sides to the cardinal directions, achieved with an accuracy of less than 1/10 of a degree, required both the observational methods to determine true north and the surveying methods to transfer that determination to the ground at the scale of a multi-acre footprint. Those methods are not described in any surviving Old Kingdom text on astronomy or land measurement. They exist as the result, visible in the monument's alignment. The process that produced the result is not in the record. Where the mathematical framework was first established, and by whom, is a question that no surviving text from any period of Egyptian history addresses as a human act occurring at a specific point in time. The relationship is present in the monument and present in the mathematical tradition as inherited knowledge. The moment it was derived does not appear in any document the surviving corpus has produced. Hemiunu's tomb inscription introduces one more specific point. The standard account consistently passes over. When Egyptian texts list a person's titles, they follow a spatial convention, with ritual and sacred functions in the upper registers and administrative functions below. Hemiunu's inscription observes this pattern, but between the ritual and administrative registers, in a position the convention does not normally use for this kind of language, there is a phrase that translators have rendered as something close to one who holds the record of the plan. The word that carries the meaning of record in that phrase draws on the glyph root Sesh. In Old Kingdom usage, Sesh is not a word for memory or retained knowledge. It is the scribal root, the word from which the designation for scribe derives, used for writing, for the physical carrying of a document, for the transmission of recorded information from one holder to another. One who carries the Sesh of the plan is one who carries the written document of the plan. The inscription describes Hemiunu not as the originator of a plan, but as the holder of a written record of one that already existed. The glyph says transmission. It does not say creation. Where the original document came from is not stated. The inscription identifies the function and leaves the source unnamed. Before going further, this is a channel about the questions the ancient world has not fully answered. Some of what has been covered here comes directly from the primary sources and the documented record. Some of it is interpretive, and where it is, the line should be visible. The aim is not to hand you a verdict. It is to show you what sits in the record when you look at it, without the assumption already in place. The combined picture these elements form is consistent across different kinds of evidence. An administrative title that names oversight rather than origination. A literary text framing the pyramid's design as something the pharaoh sought in a prior tradition. An administrative daybook with no named design authority during the construction period. A tomb inscription using a scribal transmission word rather than a design origination word. Mathematical and geometric relationships in the monument that appear in the later scribal tradition as inherited procedures without a recorded point of derivation. An orientation precision that exists as a result in stone without a surviving description of the method used to achieve it. Each of these, taken alone, permits an alternative reading. The title could be honorific shorthand. The Westcar Papyrus could be myth rather than cultural memory. Merer's records could simply be incomplete. The inscription could be a generic honorific in an unusual position. The mathematical relationships could have been worked out by Hemiunu's team and simply not recorded. Every individual piece has an exit route. Taken together, across sources of different types and different periods, they describe a record that points consistently in one direction. The design of the Great Pyramid was treated by the ancient Egyptians themselves as received rather than generated, prior rather than contemporary, belonging to a tradition rather than to an individual who was alive and working in the 4th dynasty. The culture's own texts do not describe the pyramid's geometry as a human creation of Khufu's court. They describe it as something Khufu sought in what already existed. What lies behind that word received, whether the chambers of Thoth describe a genuine body of knowledge older than the 4th dynasty, or a conventional attribution of profound design wisdom to divine tradition, in the way that all deep knowledge tended to be attributed in the ancient world, is where the documented record ends and honest theory begins. The evidence does not prove that the design came from a source predating dynastic Egypt. The evidence creates a space in which that theory is coherent with what the sources say. Those are different things, and the difference matters. What the record establishes without requiring that theory is this: the most celebrated building in the ancient world was constructed by an administrator whose title describes management, from a design whose authorship is not recorded as a human act, following a model that the pharaoh himself sought in a tradition older than his reign. Hemiunu oversaw the work. The design preceded him. The text says so in the title it gave him, in the glyph it used for his connection to the plan, and in the frame, the culture's own literature placed around the project. Hemiunu's Mastaba stands at Giza. The burial chamber below it is bare rock. His statue holds its position in a museum room in Germany. The hieroglyphs above the entrance shaft name him the overseer of the work and the carrier of the written plan. They do not name him the author of it. The pyramid's geometry was fixed before the construction began. Whoever fixed it is not in the record. The Westcar Papyrus reaches toward an explanation and arrives at a tradition too old for the 4th dynasty to claim as its own making. The Merer Papyri document the execution and leave the design's origin unspoken. The tomb inscription names the carrier of the written plan and does not give the source. The structure stands complete. The plan is in every stone of it. The name of whoever held the original before Hemiunu received his copy has not been found on any wall that any excavation has yet uncovered. The pyramid rises above the plateau every morning as it has for 4,500 years. The angles fixed, the orientation precise, the design present in the stone. 60 paces to the west, in the bedrock below the Mastaba, the empty burial chamber waits. The man who directed the building is named. The origin of what he built from is not. The gap between those two facts is measured in glyphs that say transmission, in a literary tradition that says the pharaoh sought the design rather than made it, and in a silence the record has maintained across dynasties with what feels, in the stone and the distance, like intention. The architect the biography names carried the plan. The record says so in the glyph it used and the title it assigned. What the record does not give is the name above his, the source from which the written plan descended to the man who carried it to Giza and oversaw the cutting of the stone. That name, if it ever existed in a form the ancient Egyptians preserved, has not been found. The vault, as ever, stays sealed on that particular question. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.